Founders Forum, episode 24.
Open your mind to a new episode of the Founders Forum, the podcast championing a free economy, sound assets, and blockchain solutions. Each week, your hosts, entrepreneur Cole Snell and economist Bob Murphy, interview pioneers and free thinkers to help you develop into the architect of your future.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Founders Forum. This week, I am talking with Silas Barta, who I know personally because he's a co-author with me of a book on understanding Bitcoin. And this is located at the website understandingbitcoin.us if you want to go check that out. Let me just give you a little bit of Silas's official background. Silas Barta is an early adopter of Bitcoin, having built a GPU mining rig in 2011, meaning Silas had in his house a computer setup that was adding blocks to the blockchain and getting rewarded. He spent 6 years in San Francisco working as a software engineer at tech startups and now lives in Austin, Texas. So what we did in our book on understanding Bitcoin is, at the time, I understood that there were lots of economists who were pontificating on Bitcoin, but they didn't really understand the mechanics of it. And on the other hand, there were lots of people like knee deep in the architecture and were out gaining Bitcoins through so-called mining operations. And they were talking about it in terms of it being a money and trying to relate it to gold and fiat money and such. But they didn't really understand monetary economics very well. And so part of what Silas and I did in this booklet or pamphlet was to try to bridge the two communities and give them a common vocabulary so they could speak to each other. But the other thing, though, is, and the reason Silas and I teamed up to do this, is when this booklet came out, Bitcoin was still fairly new and a lot of people just didn't understand how it worked. And so we were trying to explain it to start out at a real high level that was very understandable and intuitive, but still accurate. And then just to keep increasing the complexity and the realism so that the reader could, keep reading in a certain section to see how much, do you really want to know how it actually works versus do you just kind of want the big picture summary or analogy? And so I think we struck a pretty good mix of that. So still to this day, if somebody says, you know what, hearing a lot about this so-called Bitcoin thing, I really don't understand how it works, doesn't make sense to me, what is it? Then I would still point you to our booklet at understandingbitcoin.us. So the function of me having Silas on the Founders Forum now is just to go through some of those technical issues, again, to give people a crash course on how does Bitcoin actually work? What are some of the trade-offs involved, some of the issues that people grapple with? Is it really true that it's immutable? Or, what if there's a bug in the software? Does that mean we're just stuck with it? We can't fix it? It's impossible? So we go through all those sorts of things. Last clarification, just to be clear, Infineo itself is not involved directly with cryptocurrency. Okay, so what we're doing at Infineo is we're marrying whole life insurance with blockchain technology. So Bitcoin also uses blockchain technology, but what Infineo is doing does not involve cryptocurrencies. All right. A big distinction is some of the products that Infineo is getting ready to offer are digital tokens. So they're digital representations pointing to real world assets like whole life insurance policies, whereas Bitcoin as a cryptocurrency doesn't point to anything. It's not that if you have some Bitcoins, those are like claim tickets on some other type of asset. Bitcoin is the primitive asset itself. So that's just one distinction I want to make. I don't want to confuse anybody, even though we're now talking here in this episode about Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies in general. Infineo per se, in terms of our product set, we are not actually involved in cryptocurrencies. We're involved in the underlying technology that cryptocurrencies use, which is blockchain technology. Okay, now that we've got those caveats out of the way, here's my discussion with Silas Barta. Silas, welcome to the Founders Forum.
Glad to be here. First podcast appearance anywhere.
Well, this first and the greatest, this would be the best one. So I think probably what we should do is for one thing, start out with just some of the mechanics of what we did in our guide. I guess that's what we would call it to Bitcoin. And then, so people would have already heard my introduction for you, Silas, so you'll know some of that background. But I think still, I don't want to pat ourselves in the back too much, but I think it's, if people want to understand, it's I really haven't been keeping track of Bitcoin. I know it's a thing, but I don't know how it works. I still point them to that. So I think maybe, can you just explain a little bit about the issue of, I think it's a good diving off point, because we made a point in the book that was, coming from you, I remember, that people think it involves like cryptography, but yes and no. So maybe can you explain that subtlety?
Sure. Well, remember, cryptography is like a broad field. It would include both like encryption and signatures or authentication, as well as other things like hash functions, which are used for like making sure data wasn't corrupted, verifying, stuff wasn't changed in transit.
Oh, so can I stop you? So did I misspeak? What we said was it doesn't involve encryption? Is that what we actually said?
Correct.
Okay.
So it doesn't involve encryption. The idea behind it is you're not encrypting the transaction, you're broadcasting them for anybody to see. The part of encryption then uses is authentication or signatures, as well as hash functions too for what they call proof of work.
Okay. So again, for folks at home, and I kind of misspoke. So what we're saying is you may have been led to believe, or someone may have explicitly said that, oh yeah, Bitcoin involves encryption. Actually, it doesn't. It's similar because some of the techniques used in encryption are also used in Bitcoin, namely...
Well, I would phrase it as things used from the field of cryptography are used in Bitcoin. And also there's a sense in which, and this is getting a little technical, signatures are mathematically dual to encryption. You want to be fancy. It's like the same mathematical primitives. You kind of use them in a different direction. Don't ever go too technical there. But
okay, yeah. So let's...
bottom line, it's not encrypted. You don't use encryption for Bitcoin per se.
Okay. And folks, those of you who have been following the podcast, we touched on this. We tiptoed up to it with the episode with Tony Garcia, the data security expert. But I want to hit it here again because I didn't fully understand this myself until Silas and I worked through this, going back and forth with our drafts for our pamphlet or guide, whatever you want to call it. And by the way, that's at understandingbitcoin.us. If you want to go look that up. You might say, why not understandingbitcoin.com? Because that was already taken. So that's why it's understandingbitcoin.
Fast-moving, slithery fellow just had to reserve that before we got to it.
Yeah. So don't. Now that I said that, everyone's going to go to that one. But no, understandingbitcoin.us is where you want to go to get the pamphlet Silas and I put out. Also, let me just say, the reason we did that was back in the day. Do you remember when that came out? That would have been something I should have looked up.
We released it like December 2014.
Okay. That at that point, like I had just seen that a lot of people in like the online economics arena, they didn't understand how Bitcoin worked. And so they were like spouting off on Bitcoin from what they knew, but you could just like the stuff they were saying was ill-informed. But then on the other hand too, there were some people like, they were setting up mining rigs and whatever, like they understood how Bitcoin worked and they were, oh, money is like information or energy or, they were kind of being loosey-goosey. And so we were partly trying to write something just so the both sides could talk to each other. Okay. So having said all that, so here, can you just walk us through the idea of how can it be that you can, because when you just talk about it seems impossible. How can it be that you can do something to validate a transaction, like to be able to tell the community, yes, I am the rightful owner of these Bitcoins. Here's how I can prove it somehow. And yet the community, they can all recognize that, oh, yes, indeed, only the rightful owner of those Bitcoins could have done what we just observed.
Sure.
And yet they can't do it.
Sure,
so like they can recognize when it's done, but they can't do it themselves. And so like that's the thing that if you told that to someone and they didn't already know that there must be a solution, they would think, well, that kind of sounds impossible. How could that be?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there are two problems there. First, the problem of signing transactions so that everybody, accepts that you really did authorize that transaction. And then there's a second problem of reaching global consensus on who owns what. That is, I can sign something away, but I can sign it away to two different people. And for a transition to work, we have to, reach unambiguous agreement on which of those is the valid transaction, which of those is the correct one. So big picture, I would say the way I would describe Bitcoin network and the contribution it adds is it's a payment network where everyone agrees to use the transaction ledger with the most proven work invested in it. That would be the one sentence kind of description. And all of understanding Bitcoin amounts to breaking down that sentence, being able to understand what goes on there and understanding the possible subtleties there and implications of it.
Okay. So, and tell me if you don't think this is the right way to break it down, but like the private key versus public key thing, can you explain, like, how does that, where I do something with my private key in order to validate things that the community can recognize? And because again, that almost seems like, how could that be that
if I have this thing, in other words, how can it be that if the community doesn't have my private key, then how do they know I signed off on it? Like,
Well,
it almost seems like a paradox, but yet it is.
They came up with this genius system called public key cryptography in the 70s, which is where you have a system where you don't just have a private key, you also have a public key. You usually didn't have to make that distinction. There would just be one key that's used both for encryption and decryption. But now, public key, you want it's less like a key in that like you give it away to everybody, and it can function as an identifier. That is, I'm associated with this public string. Now, when it comes to signatures, there's an interesting property here, which is I can take some message that I want to sign. Okay, signing it means coming up with a new number with a special mathematical relationship to my public key and the message. Is that going too fast so far? Digitally signing a message means I come up with a number with a special mathematical relationship with both the message and my public key. By construction, it is very difficult to come up with that number unless you have the private key. Somebody without the private key can recognize that you came up with the correct number. That is, it'll obey a certain relationship with the public key and the message. They don't need to see the private key for that. You only need the private key to come up with the signature.
Okay, so let me again, folks, we're going to walk through this slowly. Like, that's kind of the point of this first chunk of the episode. So that's why we're going through this slowly. Is, I don't want to just gloss over. I really want you to get this if you care. So the idea is the community has the public key, and so they know, any Bitcoins that right now the ledger associates with, I'll say Robert Murphy, but technically it would be like an address or something. It wouldn't be a guy's name. The public key is kind of saying that's the thing we're going to check to see if the rightful owner of that address or the controller of it does something, like it gives us a message, we can compare it with the public key to be able to verify that, yes, only the person who had the private key would have been able to produce this thing.
They'll give a message, and then they'll give a signature with that message. And then anybody can go and say, does the special mathematical property between that public key and the signature and the message hold?
And the message would be something like, transfer 1.2 Bitcoins from this address to this other address.
Correct.
And now sign it. So like back in the day, like when the king would, write messages to his, captains in the front lines, and then put it in an envelope and use his signet ring. And it would be hard for someone, because they don't have that exact ring with the wax, to be able to verify. It's designed the contents of this message came from the king.
Correct.
Because only he could have
that kind of situation.
Yeah. So here again, there's like the message is whatever it is, but then the signing is the thing whereby it's some math. And again, folks, we're going to walk you through it in a second. I just wanted you to get the big picture, is to show how can we be confident that the contents of this message really are endorsed by, it's like, I am so-and-so when I approve this message. And so the public key means, because that's going to be unique to each of the addresses. Is that correct to say? Each address would have its own public key.
/public key is going to have some hidden private key associated with it. That's different.
Right. But right now, what I'm trying to isolate, though, is each address has its own public key. In other words, the public, because otherwise, So now we've got people to the point where they're saying, okay, so I kind of get what you're saying, what the claims are, Bob and Silas, that somehow using a private key mathematically, you can do something that the community, having the public key already, that's public knowledge, that's why they call it public key, can then verify and say, yes, it would be. So can you, what I don't know, is this appropriate time, Silas, to bring up your analogy with the animals and how many legs they have?
Yes. Because in the book, we use the example of saying, or if you want to start with
right. So what we're now doing, folks, is we're trying to show you is, I guess, this is called a trapdoor function, right?
This is a trapdoor one-way function. Yes.
Okay. And so the analogy, folks, is what we're going to walk you through here is to say mathematically, the way this works is the person with the private key is able to take some information and do something to it to transform it in a way that it's easy to verify that the answer has a certain property, but it would be hard to go in reverse. And so just like it's easy to fall through a trap door, but it's hard to come back up. I think that's where the term comes from. And so before, we're not going to get so much into the math of it right now. We just want to give you an analogy so you can understand what would it mean to say it's hard to generate the answer, but once someone proposes an answer, it's easy to verify, is this a solution or not?
Gotcha.
And so can you go ahead with the animal, explain what that analogy is?
There's a traditional problem from algebra. It says like, on my farm, I just have chickens and I have horses. Chickens having one head and two legs, horses having one head and four legs. And I tell you that I have a certain number of total heads, certain number of total legs. And you would want to reverse that back and figure out how many chickens and how many horses there are, because it's going to have a unique solution. Now, in this analogy, the sort of private knowledge would be the formula that goes the other way and goes from heads and legs to chickens and horses.
Right. So let me just make sure folks are getting that. So the idea is that in a word problem or something, somebody says, hey, like there's a farmer, he's got 8 chickens and 10 horses. Of that group of animals, how many total heads are there and how many total legs are there?
Right. That would be like the easy direction.
That would be easy to do, right? You just figure, however told me animals times 1 is how many heads. And then, 2 legs for each chicken and 4 legs for each horse. You add that up and that's the total. So that wouldn't be too, a 5th grader could do that. You give them a piece of paper and a pencil. Back when I was in 5th grade, nowadays, who knows? But that was something a 5th grader could have done. What would be a lot harder would be to just give the person and say, there's a group of animals consisting of chickens and horses. In that group, I'm telling you, there's this many heads and this many total legs. Now you tell me how many chickens are there and how many horses. It can be done, using algebra, but that's a lot harder. So of course, it's not that it's impossible. So don't misunderstand, folks. We're just trying to show how there could be a problem where
you
going one way. Sorry, go ahead, Silas.
If you came up with some great mathematical advance, maybe you'll unlock it and make it so that both directions are easy because you had enough mathematical insight. They put these protocols out when they're at the point where it's like, no, this doesn't look like it's actually easy to reverse. Going the other way is still mathematically intractable.
Okay, let's make sure they get the one-wayedness, and then we'll talk about how permanent is the one-wayedness. So, but just so people get the idea, right, that I hope everyone gets the idea that, if I told you how many chickens and horses, it would be easy for you to tell me how many heads and legs. But if I just told you how many heads and legs, actually that is a unique, there is just a single combination of chickens and horses that produces that number that maps to it. But it's harder to go the other way. Now, if you know algebra and write it out, it's not.
Another, I want to add a little caveat here for the pedantic people out here. Like the reason, among many, that this whole chicken horse system isn't used in cryptography is because it's too easy and the two directions are too close in difficulty. That is, you're a 5th grader without knowledge of algebra, going the reverse direction is very, very difficult. But then once we know algebra and stuff, they're too close in difficulty for this to be practical. If you want an actual crypto system, you would want a way where the forward direction is easy and then the other direction is much, 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 much more difficult. Not just a little bit more difficult. You need to have it very asymmetric.
Okay. So, right. I do want to, we will touch on that in a second here. I want to make sure everyone's getting, why are we even mentioning the analogy? So again, folks, the idea is there was a simple example of why, going one way is relatively easy, going the other way is harder. Both ways are still possible. And so we're saying that's the analogy. And so likewise, what happens in the real world with Bitcoin, for example, or just in general, public-private key cryptography, is that when you sign something, it's very easy to verify. And so maybe just to finish the train of thought with that analogy, Silas. So if somebody says, hey, we have 16,000 heads and this many legs, how many chickens and horses? And people are just, boy, I don't know. I get, if you didn't know how to use the algebra, you could just be sitting there and trying trial and error. And wow, we were going to have to be guessing and checking because the idea is it's very easy to check a particular guess.
Correct.
And
when
so
somebody comes back and says, okay, I know the answer. It's this many chickens and this many horses.
Right.
Then you can easily just say, oh, multiply, add.
Yes.
Oh, and it does add up to the original figures.
Right. So in that analogy, again, if people didn't know algebra and they were just sitting there trying to guess and it was really big number, then if somebody just very quickly says, oh, I know what the answer is, it's this, everybody could check real fast to see, does that work? If
Sure.
if it didn't work, they would say, no, we we don't believe you. So again, if the idea would be the person who would be the only one in the community that would know the answer right away would be the person who originally decided how many chickens and horses there were.
Right. The only person that can quickly come up with the answer is the person that has the private key, which in this analogy would be a formula for converting between heads and legs into cows and horses, or chickens and horses. Sorry, keep getting animals and stuff.
Okay, so that's, I think, we've beaten those chickens and horses to death. So that's like the sense. So that's what Bitcoin does. And so again, it's the math. The problems are obviously much, much harder, but the idea being that there's certain mathematical operations such that when you, so maybe just give a little bit. So what does it actually mean when you sign something? Is it really just a thing that's appended, or is the whole message itself transformed through the act of signature?
Well, you would just send a message, and then at the end of the message, also a signature to say that, it's really authentic, and then people can check. I see the message, I see the public key associated, I see the digital signature. Those obey a certain mathematical property. Anybody can verify that it's valid.
Okay. And again, folks, if somebody didn't have that private key, for them to try to just stumble upon the ability to be able to sign would be like an art analogy with the fifth grader just trying, some huge number of legs.
It would be invisibly difficult to come up with that signature. Only the person with the private key can do it easily.
Okay. Maybe so I do want to come back to this issue of how secure is that, and what does it mean? Do we know that actually it's secure, or it's just we think it is? But before I do that, can we talk a little bit more? Because you said, Silas, there that this technique was actually known in the 70s.
Correct. This just solves the problem of how do you have digital signatures at all. In order to get to the Bitcoin system, you had to solve an additional problem on top of that, which is not just signatures, but validating, like if somebody is signing contradictory messages, if they're double spending their coins, how do you reach consensus on which ones you're actually going to use? Problem of reaching consensus, or they call it solving the double spend problem. And that is where some other innovations of Bitcoin had to come in.
Okay, so, and just for people that have the big picture, so was it Satoshi Nakamoto? Am I saying that right? Yes. So that was the pseudonymous name of the author of the famous Bitcoin white paper, which came out in 2008.
Yes.
Is that right? And so it wasn't that Satoshi solved the public-private key stuff, because like you said, that had been solved in the 70s. So again, maybe if we dwell a second before we understand what was it. And so what Satoshi solved was this double spend problem?
Yes.
Okay. So let's just make sure the folks at home are understand, because here, I'll pretend that I thought I got it and I don't see what the problem is. I'd say, wait a minute. If we start out with, a public ledger and we know who owns the Bitcoins at times one, now isn't it just a matter of if each transaction can be authenticated, signed by the owner? Why is there any issue? So what happens at time two is just look at all the valid signatures, and if so-and-so transferred 2 Bitcoins to this address, well, then he's not allowed to send any more. So can't you just look at the time at which it was sent and say the first valid one, and he tries to spend those again and say, no, because you said it 2 minutes ago. You can't.
Sure. And you could naively go in and say can't we just go by what order they happened in? But the problem is that just pushes the problem back a levels. How do you get people to agree on what order transactions happened in? You need to have a way to have consensus on the ordering of the transactions. And in the original paper, he says his solution is effectively creating making the terminology, but he's effectively creating a distributed timestamp system, or a way of reaching consensus on the ordering of transactions. So yes, going by what order they happened in works, but it just pushes it back to the question of how do you get people to agree on what order transactions happened in? You can't just say, you trust everybody to tell you what time it happened in, because people could lie about what time it was going on.
Okay. Actually, I didn't even, I'm a co-author on this, but that little subtlety, it escaped me. Okay. So, right, just because you can prove that you are who you say you are and you're the rightful owner of that address, so far, everything we've talked about, there's no way to timestamp when you signed it. All we can prove is that you signed it.
If I could introduce one side analogy, kind of like the old school, centralized version of this problem would be like, if I'm selling my house and I go and I make a contract, I sell it to one person, sign it, sell it to a different person, sign it. Those centralized systems run into the same problem of saying, if somebody signed his house away to 2 people, well, which one's the valid one?
Okay.
And that
Nice. Right. So to go back to our earlier, so like the king, if he's, or, if everybody has their own signet ring with the wax and whatever. So yeah, you can show that, no, here's a deed to this house and this property, and everybody recognizes that, for years I'm the owner of this, and I sell it to this guy for this many, ounces of gold. We sign contract, we put in a thing, and I seal it with my thing, and he seals it maybe with his ring too, to show the community we both agreed to this contract. It has to be, right? We each have our respective rings to be able to seal it in the wax like that. But then what if I do the same thing with some other guy?
Correct.
And like you're saying, like we could write the times on there, but I could sell it to the one guy, and we could put, it happened on February 12th at noon. And then I go to this other guy over here, and I say, let's write it happened on February 11th at noon. And we can both agree. So it wouldn't be good enough just to say, hey, see, they both agreed, because what if we're both lying? And then I sold that guy the house.
Yeah. In these kind of old school systems, they would have sort of central ledgers, trusted third parties. If you try to do this with your house in real life, they would go and they would do the title check, and they'd be like, wait a second, somebody already else, signed away from this.
Right.
Or else you wouldn't trust that the contract is valid until they've done that check to validate that it's a clean title that can actually be transferred to you.
Right. Okay. So I think people now get like, oh, okay, we kind of, you guys walked us up to the edge, without getting too mathematical about what is it, how could it be that you can sign and prove you're the owner, or that you are who you say you are, but then now you're saying, Silas, that's not enough, because then you could try to spend the same coins multiple times and legitimately, authentically sign off on each of those transactions. And so now that's the problem Satoshi solved. Why don't you take a stab at it, and how do you want to try to explain to people, like, big picture first, and then maybe we'll try to get it more realistic, but harder.
Okay. Sure. The way I say it is that the way that we in Bitcoin would solve the problem of which transaction is the valid one, which one actually happened first, would be to say, well, we're only going to use whichever valid ledger has the most proven work invested in it. There will only be one that has the most proven work invested in it, and that provides a sort of a central kind of focal point for everybody to agree this is the valid one. Big picture, that's the answer. And rather with context, you could contrast it with other ways of solving the double spend problem. I just gave the other way for real estate transfers. Their solution is a centralized ledger that you always check against to decide whether it's a valid, whether the person has the right to transfer that to you, whether it's valid in that sense, whether they didn't already give it away to somebody else. You could also look at physical cash as another system that has to solve that problem. And that one, a pretty old school solution, is that all the cash is represented by physical pieces of paper. So you can't double spend, because you haven't actually spent it until you physically handed over the piece of paper. And once you have it, you no longer have that piece of paper to hand over to somebody else. So very, very low tech way of solving the problem.
Okay. And so with each of those systems, there's pros and cons. So with cash, one of the difficulties is it's hard for me to physically send $20 bills to somebody in Thailand if I want to buy something.
Be kind of physically present with them.
Yeah. All right. The problem with the centralized title registry is, among other things, you have to trust whatever authority or organization, institutional structure is maintaining those records. They could make a mistake, or they could just be corrupt. And so that's the problem with that. And so the dream of Bitcoin was it was going to be peer-to-peer and trustless.
Yes.
And so can you maybe just, I think for this base, let's make sure we're not leaving anybody behind. So what does that mean in this context? When we say trustless, does that mean, you shouldn't trust in it? No, it actually doesn't mean that. What does it mean when people say Bitcoin is trustless?
In that there's no designated central person that you have to trust in doing all of this. That is the sort of, you could think of it as saying that trust is kind of distributed throughout the system, and that the solution is, well, we're going by whichever ledger has the most proven work in it. That's something that doesn't require you to trust any one person to say, oh yeah, this has the most work in it. Instead, you look at the math and the cryptography behind it, and everybody can independently look at it and say, oh yeah, that one has the most work invested in it. There's no person with special privileges to tell you how much work is invested in it. It's just something everybody can figure out on their own.
Okay. And does this go along with sometimes people describe, say, nobody's in charge of Bitcoin? And they might also say you can't really shut down Bitcoin because you could throw a bunch of people in jail, you could blow up some servers or whatever, but as long as there's a few people left on Earth who have downloaded copies of the ledger.
The transaction record is still around. You can still make new transactions. People could still continue to recognize the validity of the new transactions. Now, that's not to say it's 100% impossible. Conceivably, with enough work, you see anybody sends out a message that follows the Bitcoin protocol, you could go and try to jail them. But the idea would be that it's very resilient against these things, and that it's easy enough to keep broadcasting transactions, and it becomes a real Herculean feat to stomp them all out.
Okay, so again, just to make sure people get the big, if Bank of America has a bunch of customers with checking accounts and they have balances, and there's probably multiple copies of that, but it's all kind of controlled by Bank of, if there's a fire in one building, it's not like Bank of America's, oh, sorry, we have no idea how much money anybody has anymore. Like they have systems in place for redundancy, but still Bank of America is kind of in charge of that. And then even if you trusted them, but if the US government decides, hey, we need new protocols because of 9/11, and they can lean on Bank of America and make them comply. Like there's,
that comes up in things like it came to a head with WikiLeaks, and it's like, well, they didn't actually have a law that says you can't donate it, but they could just go to a few financial choke points that are processing the electronic transactions and use whatever tools they have to kind of threaten them or whatever to say, hey, don't process these transactions. And so there's a limited number of ways you can go through. It's 100% centralized, but there are a few guardians, kind of choke points there that make it so that you can't, in practice, make that electronic transaction. And the idea being with something like Bitcoin, it's not centralized in that sense. There would be a bunch of other validators that would still look at it and see it, and it would go through as valid.
Okay, and so maybe if we just spend a little bit more time on this to push it. So you said the way Satoshi solves the problem, the double spend problem, and how can it be that, quote, the network can know, in a sense, which transactions are valid, or to decide, of various orders to transfer Bitcoins from one address to another. How do we decide which is the one that we're going to say makes it into the ledger and is considered authentic or legitimate, that it's through proof of work? Can you maybe elaborate just a little bit more on what is that? How do they coordinate? Like what does that mean? Like a bunch of computers know to process that transaction and not another one? What does that mean?
Well, part of the rules of the network is that if there's any block ledger update, or block as they call it, for a ledger update to come through, there has to be a proof of work associated with it, which means they take a math problem that was generated from that transaction history, and then somebody has to prove that they solved it with a known difficulty level. By solving that generated math problem with its known difficulty level, you've effectively proven that you have invested work into that transaction. And that's still a lot to take in, but we can go step by step and explain how that works. I can start off with the analogy in our book we use about the guessing game and about how that implicitly proves a certain amount of work was associated with it.
Go ahead.
So if you imagine like the sort of guessing game, which is, I'm thinking of a number, can you guess what it is? And in this version of it, you get to keep guessing until you've guessed the right one. And for simplicity, we're going to assume that I'm a perfect random number generator. There's no pattern how I pick out my number, and that I can't cheat. That is, if you guess my number, I really have to admit it that you got my number. And in this kind of model, there's sort of a predictable number of guesses it takes to get the number. That is, if we go through, there's 0 through 9 or something, 10 possible numbers. Then on average, it takes 5.5 guesses. You're going to go that way. And so if you could somehow prove that you won the guessing game 100 times, then you have proven that you made about 550 guesses. You have done about 550 guesses worth of work.
Okay.
Maybe it's simple enough so far, or is this?
Yeah, I think that's good. Yeah.
And as it turns out, there's basically a cryptographic version of this where using another cryptographic primitive they call hash functions, which you might think of as scrambler functions. Easy to compute forward, hard to compute the other direction. Yeah, the idea being that you can use these, and challenges, you'll have some like target. It takes a lot to explain the system. But first thing to keep in mind is that as a cryptographic version of it, it obeys the same properties, in that you can set a difficulty and there's a predictable number of guesses it takes in order to guess the right input to a hash function for the solution.
Okay, so is it correct to say, at least loosely speaking, that when a new block gets mined, is that the right terminology?
Yes.
To be added to the Bitcoin ledger? Is that still correct? Okay.
Yes.
What these computers are doing, and people at this point probably know, like there's massive, computer banks that are just designed specifically for the task of this purpose. But in a sense, they're just randomly guessing and they're like just shooting blindly, but they can verify ex post if they hit it.
Correct.
And so it's like
sort of like the same with the signature problems. Like they'll guess a bunch of possible inputs, and then they'll find one that obeys the right mathematical property, which we can get into. And once they found one that has a mathematical property, then they can post a solution. People can validate that it's a solution for a certain difficulty that validates that they spent a certain amount of work on average into it. That is, just like with the guessing game, you could say, well, if you won the guessing game 100 times, you must have made about 550 guesses. Same thing. You can basically approximate how much work on average somebody must have done to solve that. And then by putting that on, they basically said, well, we've contributed this much work. It connects to this past chain of blocks or blockchain. It connects to this past blockchain itself has much work. It now becomes the reigning ledger. It has the most work in it. This is a central focal point. Everybody will agree this has the most work invested in it. And then you can trust that that's a valid transaction history.
Okay. And that's interesting too, that I've never heard someone spell it like it's called a blockchain because it's a chain of blocks. And so that's why when you mine new blocks, you add it to the pre-existing one, and hence the blockchain gets one block longer. Okay.
Exactly.
Okay. So tell me if this is a true statement. So the idea is that whatever the amount of computing power at any given time that's being devoted to trying to find the solutions to these mathematical problems that the system sort of poses, to say the person who gets awarded, gets to mine what the next block is that's going to be added to the existing blockchain, has to solve this math problem.
Right.
And now we think that's going to take a lot of computing power given known techniques, because they're basically just going to be running through a bunch of possibilities until it hits.
Functions were designed so that there is no intelligent way to guess the right answer. All you have to do is just guess everyone, grind through the math of it, and see if it has the right properties.
Okay. And so the idea is it doesn't, in a sense, guarantee justice, let's say, or whatever ethical behavior. But what it does do is ensure that like someone just can't waltz in and very quickly mine a block with some bogus transact. Like in order to be able to do that, they would have to,
in order to push that block on.
A lot of processing power relative to the whole network.
Correct. They would have to have spent enough in order to find a solution for that block, in order for it to be accepted. And of course, the way he kind of incentivizes it is that the protocol says, if you successfully contribute one of these blocks, you get a block reward, which is the reason people try to solve these and contribute to the network to begin with. But maybe jumping ahead there.
Right. Yeah. So we'll talk in a minute about why would anyone care to do this. But right now we're just figuring. And then another thing that's really interesting about this is the more computers that jump into the system and are trying to find the solution to be able to mine the next block and then get whatever rewards might be attendant thereon, the system updates, either scales up or down the difficulty of the problem.
Right. It's going for like a relatively constant rate of block production. And as more people come in, you might start solving blocks faster. And so part of the protocol is that there's a sort of corresponding adjustment in difficulty factors, so that if more people come on, the difficulty factor goes up. Translated into its implications, the difficulty factor is a measure of how precise your solution is to be, or rather, how much work it will take on average to get a solution.
Okay. And so that's, back in the day when Bitcoin was first launched and barely anybody cared about it, the total amount of processing power, computing power in the network to validate each new block was relatively low. And so the math problems that you had to solve, or as you're saying, right, that it's not really that you're solving it so much as getting an answer that's sufficiently close to the true answer. for the system to say, yep, good enough, you get the block. It adjusts those parameters so that the flow of new blocks being added is roughly predictable. So right now, people can say, oh, when will the 21 million Bitcoins have been fully mined? They can give a pretty accurate estimate. Like you might think, oh, well, doesn't it matter like if there's advances in computing power or how many? No, because
as it's advanced, that'll just mean the difficulty factor will update and you'll need more. And if power transaction capacity, computational capacity leaves the network, the difficulty factor will go down.
Right, which could happen like if all of a sudden people lose faith in Bitcoin or some new cryptocurrency comes along that people like better and Bitcoin crashes in price.
Right.
And so lots of people say, yeah, I don't want to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars in electricity mining something that right now one Bitcoin's worth $2. Then
the market price. You mean that like the market price goes down and discourages miners. It can be that energy costs go up because these are very energy intensive.
Right. Okay. So that's good. So can we now circle back a little bit about people talk about, it would take, don't worry about it. Even if the CIA had been devoted all their mainframes and blah, 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 it would take them 600 years to crack this. And when people talk like that, how do they know? Is it like literally a mathematical theorem, or is it more like cutting edge state of the art of cryptography or math, this type of math? As far as we know, nobody has any algorithm for doing this besides brute force.
Right. It's closely true to the latter and similar problem with the public key, private key cryptography. As far as we know, there are no shortcuts to solving those math problems except by trying every possible answer. And now this kind of goes back to the history of hash functions. It's like they've been used long before this problem to provide a level of security. They get used in storing passwords. It's the same idea there that when a website wants to authenticate you by password, they don't store the password itself. They store the hash of the password.
Actually, can we maybe spend a minute on that? Because when Tony Garcia was on there, and sorry, folks, if you're watching the video, I have to plug in my laptop. I have proof of electricity. Because he touched on it, but he breezed through it. But the first time I learned that, I was really interested because I was always worried about if I'm at a Starbucks, is it safe for me to log into my bank account? Because then I'm thinking, well, doesn't Starbucks now know what my login is to my bank account? And people were like, no, that's not how it works. So can you maybe explain how can it be that I can prove to my bank and I can communicate confidentially with my bank, but yet the intermediary isn't able just to intercept all those, they can...
Well, that's kind of combining separate issues. They have what they call HTTPS, they use about secure socket layer. Now they call it transportation layer security, where basically there's a separate protocol to set it up so that you have some secure channel for sending the information. But within that channel, you're still sending the password itself to Bank of America when you log on to their site. But for
that's the issue. So it's not that at Bank of America they have a file folder cabinet somewhere, or even of an electronic document that has everyone's password.
Correct. They do not store the password itself. They rather they store the result of putting that password through a hash function. So they can still authenticate you when you give them the password, but they try to avoid having it stored somewhere. The idea being somebody goes in and gets access to that database. They don't get the password itself. They just get the result of putting it through a hash function. And that's still bad. It's just not as bad because it means that if they want to go and start authenticating you, they have to use that hash output and then guess the password to ensure that it hashes to that value to figure out what your password is. It's still a lot of work. So
this goes back to our horse and chicken analogy that someone with the password in this case is like the private key, and so that if you start out with that, it's easy to do the mathematical operation to generate the hash. So then Bank of America.
I wouldn't put it in that terms because the example there is motivated by the concept of explaining the private key, where it's easy to reverse and you just have that key, but it doesn't quite map over. But the bottom line is correct.
Is this correct? So what Bank of America has on its end is the hash of my password.
Right.
If I have my password, it's easy to take that, do some mathematical operation to it to generate the hash, and they can just check, does this hash generate the password match?
The reason I wouldn't put it that way is because it's basically no matter what your input is, it's easy to hash it. Property is just that password is one way to guarantee that when you hash it, you'll get the value in the database.
Okay. I think I'm thinking of it the right way. It's maybe my vocabulary is a little off. Okay.
Sure. With one side note here, like as an interesting fact of hash functions, there's going to be multiple inputs that hash to the same value. You can do that just by whatever pigeonhole counting arguments. The hash output has like a fixed size. So basically, when you consider a variable, when you consider the input can be any possible length, there's going to be multiple values that will hash to the same output. In practice, they're extremely difficult to find.
Of two people picking random passwords that have the same hash, the chance of that is vanishingly small.
Correct.
Okay. So that was kind of just a side tangent, but I did want to hit that because I always thought that was amazing and like to reassure. Because like I always thought, like if I'm in some hotel in an Eastern European country, like I don't know who these people are. Maybe they're just capturing all my stuff. Well you said that's a separate thing.
100% secure because like
you said that's a separate thing.
Stop somebody from having a site you have to authenticate to, right? And maybe they don't do it the right way, and they just do have a text file of passwords. You do kind of have to trust that the site is doing things securely and they're not storing the password in plain text, as it's called. Because one thing that that a shady site could do is run thing and, I have to make a password for this site, give them my email, and give them my password of that site, and I'm sloppy, and I use the password on other sites, and that person can say, I got the email, got one of the passwords he uses, I'll go and use it on the other sites. Legitimate businesses don't want that kind of possibility.
Yeah, you're right. I'm sorry. I conflated two things again there. Right. So the original important point is that the reputable businesses, they don't keep copies of your password on file. So even if they get hacked or whatever, then it's not as bad as someone might have thought.
Right.
That it's not that
you still want to change your password, but you still have like a long time before the hackers can feasibly figure out what their password is from that database.
Okay. All right. So back to Bitcoin then. So they believe right now, the state of the art, that, with the way the math problems that the network gives, it's really nothing but just brute force to try to get close enough to the solution that the system would award you the next block.
But
in principle, somebody, it could be like in the movie Sneakers with Robert Redford. People remember that, where some math guy could come up with, wait a minute, no, there's actually a simpler way to come to this.
Yes. And in fact, that happens kind of over the history because, a long time ago, they came up with the first, viable cryptographic hash function used. But then after enough time, researchers say, oh, no, this has some vulnerability. And so we need to stop using that and go to something else. Now, the good news is that it never happens that they've reduced it to a trivial problem all at once so that you can just quickly. What in practice, when they break it, what they mean is, here's a way to guess things like, 1% better than chance, or 1% better than chance would actually be pretty good. They find that they haven't completely solved it, but they found that it doesn't make it so you can brute force it. They make it has a vulnerability that lets you do 1% better than just guessing by chance. And then that's your warning. Maybe other vulnerabilities come down the line. Now is the time to start transitioning. So generally speaking, before attacks become practical, the security community will say, okay, now we're at the time where we need to migrate off of this hash function to the latest, greatest. And that makes sense.
Yes. Okay. So again, just to paraphrase for the people at home, it has happened in the history of this field that what was considered the state of the art, would I say cryptographic function, or is that not the right terminology?
Hash function.
Hash function that was seen to be very secure over time as people studied it, and someone's like, actually, if you did blah, 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 it would be better than just random chance, but it's not like you could solve it with a calculator.
Correct.
And it's that, it would, so instead of taking 100 years to find it, it would only take you, 90 years or something.
Right.
And so then they say, let's, and so that gives them, there's some room for error. Like they have time to adjust and switch over before it's really.
Correct. And in all likelihood, Bitcoin will probably go through the same thing as, they can't vulnerabilities. They call it SHA-256 or SHA-256 hash function. That one eventually might find some vulnerabilities. Now, it's particularly funny in this case because you can, if there's anything with an incentive to solve and to break, it would be SHA-256 because that means a lot of free Bitcoins if you can solve it. Even if you can do a little bit better than chance, that saves you from a lot of computations you'd otherwise have to do. So basically, you can think of right now on planet Earth, there's a massive contest with massive incentives for weakening or slightly breaking the SHA-256 cryptographic function. And so far, we're not at the point where, it's enough that we want to start replacing it.
Do you have any idea of are there hedge funds around the world that have math PhDs hard at work at that? And then if they do find it, they wouldn't tell anybody?
I don't know any concrete thing about that. But yes,
obviously it's not that you'd be hanging out with the guy at the bar and he'd be like, oh, you know what I do for a living? I'm just saying, what's your guess? I get, who knows? But
I would guess that somebody out there would get the idea and try to mathematically solve it. I certainly got tempted that way because I'm like, if you just found some weakness, that saves you a lot of money. But this is one of those things where you have kind of the top minds and, researchers want to reveal it if they have it. Although, in theory, somebody could keep it secret and say, well, I'm just going to keep my 1% advantage over everybody else, or 2%, or, maybe 5% at the highest. And for all we know, that might be out there. It's vanishingly unlikely because generally, somebody finds that small vulnerability, it's not going to be that long before somebody else finds the same vulnerability, and eventually somebody discloses it. So I'd say that's pretty unlikely.
And just as a thought experiment, just for people to understand more of the economics of it, suppose somebody did, maybe there is some hedge fund somewhere in Singapore and, they got a whole team of PhD and they do come up with something and it's a significant advantage. Like if they wanted to, they could get every new block if they wanted to. Would they probably actually not do that because that would be obvious? And maybe they would just okay, let's.
Correct. From the game theoretical perspective, they wouldn't just want to start magically getting all of them. They want to get us so that, they solve it faster than others, but it is a way that you can explain away. It's okay, yeah, maybe they hired some other.
And maybe they could set up shell companies and stuff. And so it wouldn't be obvious.
Distributed across that.
Okay. And just in case folks, because obviously if they just started banging it out and the same group just took over, everybody would lose faith in Bitcoin and the market price
would network and people might say, this isn't actually secure. Right. It's going to collapse someday. And
so that's why they wouldn't
migrate off it.
They would want to be more coy about it. Okay, well that's good. So why don't we, in the time we have left here, switch over a bit. So I know you've been doing something. I want people to get an idea of, someone who is involved in finance, and we talk somewhat theoretically about this stuff, but I know you've been involved just in your own, day-to-day operations with some recent events. So maybe you can just give a flavor.
I heard the sirens call and came back to crypto after kind of closing out of it mostly, and kind of explored the kind of interesting stuff they're doing with Ethereum smart contracts and unrelated. So minor detail there. With smart contracts, you can script it to do things and obey certain rules and set up your kind of own system on top of it. Bitcoin by design had a very limited system of what you can do with smart contracts, whereas Ethereum yourselves, to be much more general about it. And so when you want to find the more complicated, interesting smart contracts, you're going to see those mainly on Ethereum, on those with similar capabilities. I can go a high level of some of the interesting things they do with them. One of them would be collateralized borrowing. This is a system where you can lock some tokens. There's Ethereum. There are other tokens that live on the Ethereum network. You can kind of lock them into a smart contract. That's your collateral. You can kind of borrow against it in a decentralized way. And then it'll charge it. That smart contract will be set so that it has this kind of fluctuating interest rate that you have to pay. We think of it as analogous to a pawn loan. You put your pawn up as collateral, your Beanie Babies or whatever, or gold or whatever. You borrow against it. Could be in a stable coin, could be borrowing Ethereum, could be borrowing another token off of it. And then the interest will accumulate over time. And if the smart contract is set up so that if your debt is too big relative to the collateral's value, somebody can come in and liquidate you.
Okay. And the big picture with all this stuff is because it's all on blockchain, it has the same properties of a trustless peer-to-peer. Correct. Nobody's in charge of these. Once you have the thing out there, it's not that some authority figure can just come in and say, actually we're going to invalidate that contract. It's kind of
right. It's all transparent. You see all of the money, all the cryptocurrency, it has access to at any given point. All the loans outstanding, all the loans that have been liquidated, all publicly available. What's been great for me is I've been using this as a way to short sell, because you can borrow certain cryptocurrencies that you think are overvalued, sell them, and then hope that once they go down, which they usually do, because a lot of them get hyped and then they collapse. buy them back and settle your loan. Generally speaking, like if you wanted to short sell, you'd have to find some broker to like lend you the money. And this one, it validated, in a decentralized way, values your collateral, determines how much to give you, automatically, allows somebody to liquidate it if you, have borrowed too much and aren't at the point where you can pay it back.
Okay. All right. Actually, I forgot. I did want to spend a bit more time on the Bitcoin stuff. The issue with the scalability. So
gotcha, yes.
Can you it just popped in my head. I remember we want to touch on that. So
sure.
Can you explain? So, and I remember I was stunned when I first read this, that I don't know if you know the specific numbers, but it's kind of like even at maximum capacity, the most Bitcoin transactions that could possibly be validated in a certain amount of time is such and such, and it's like
something like 7
nowhere
transactions.
Near. So what is it?
Something like 7 transactions per second.
Okay, and that's like baked into the design of Bitcoin itself.
Well, baked into specific parameters chosen for it, which the network could fork to update. Which, let me spell that out a bit. In the original version, Satoshi said, "Okay,
hang on. So before we get, so again, just to make sure people get what we're dwelling on here. So the idea is that 7 transactions per second, if it stays like that, obviously Bitcoin can't replace fiat money issued by governments. Right? Like MasterCard does way more transactions.
Talking about just using the Bitcoin on-chain transactions.
Right. So can you spend a minute just explain, like, where did that come from? Was that in Satoshi's white paper, or was that later?
Well, it was just sort of an arbitrary implementation detail that okay, here's the abstract Bitcoin protocol, and then concretely here's the software that implements it with very specific rule. Here's where you put the signature, here's where you put the amount, here's where you put the destination address. There's all those kinds of parameters in it, and one of them might be okay, we're only going to allow 1 megabyte per block, which in practice translates to about 7 transactions per second. Now.
Okay, so that's the issue, because the number of new blocks coming on per time is baked into the cake.
Right.
And so then the way you would have to get more transactions is if you allowed more bytes.
Well, 2 ways.
block.
You can update the protocol itself and say, okay, we're just going to allow 30 megabytes or potentially infinite megabytes and have no limit. And then another way would be this is what they call the side chaining, is okay, we're going to keep the 1 megabyte stuff for on chain, but we're going to have some systems where people can take coins and lock them into a special smart contract somewhere. And as long as everybody has their Bitcoins on the smart contract, people can transact from them. It will not produce a transaction on the main Bitcoin network. It doesn't eat up from that 7 transactions per second. They all just transact among themselves, keep records of it separate. And then when you want to go back onto the network, there's a correspondingly trustless protocol to say, sending my Bitcoins back onto the main network. And there's a way to prove that, yes, this is the amount that I have as a result of all these transactions, without, of course, copying that entire transaction record back onto the network, if that makes sense.
Okay, yeah. So those are the 2 main areas. So let's, for right now, focus on why is there the 1 megabyte limit in the first place? Yeah, why wouldn't you just
limit it at all?
Yeah.
The answer would be you want to make it so that as many nodes as possible can participate in the network, because any node that participates basically has to keep a version of the entire transaction history so they know which transactions are valid. So that they see one spending money it doesn't have, to reject it. And so this was sort of a way of making it easier for many, many nodes to be on the network and ensure decentralization. Because you imagine an alternate world where everybody had to have 50 terabytes, maybe 50 terabytes per block or some insanely high memory limit. That would severely limit how many nodes can actually be on the network. Allows the government to come in and say, well, as long as we can threaten the 3 people that could run Bitcoin nodes, we're good.
Okay, so let me stop you. So by the way, can you go another 20 minutes?
Sure.
Okay. So folks at home, can you stay with us 20 more minutes? Okay, good. So the deal is that there's a trade-off, that the more memory that you allowed per block, then yes, in theory, the more transactions that could be processed per block and hence per unit time, since the blocks come out, at a predetermined rate. That's what the difficulty adjustment is designed to hit. So the flow of new, and we actually didn't mention that, but that's in the beginning, when new Bitcoins come into existence, that's the way they do it, is through these new, the person who validates a new block gets awarded new Bitcoins that now exist for the first time on the chain. And so the trade-off is and this may be something people didn't realize, when someone like a new computer joins the network to say, hey, I want to be involved in this network process of validating the new transactions that are submitted. And so I want to have a shot. I want my system to be able to go through and like try to guess the answer to this math problem. And if I happen to get close enough before anybody else does, then I get awarded the block. It's not just that they dive in and look at the current transactions and the current distribution of Bitcoins among addresses. When you join, you actually download the entire history from day one.
Right. Any miner would need to have the entire transaction history. And why? Because you got to solve a math problem associated with a block that you're trying to get into a network. The network's only going to accept it if there are, valid transactions within the block. How do you know they're valid? You have to have the entire transaction history. So
everybody downloads the entire blockchain if they want to jump into the process of trying to become part of the network, as it were.
Correct.
And so the trade-off, like we said, that is, so the whole nobody's in charge, it's trustless. You kind of have in the back of your mind that there's thousands and thousands of unrelated individuals or institutions with their own separate computing systems in competition, vying. Whereas if it were really just a case of, no, really only 3 people on planet Earth have systems powerful enough to the blockchains are so massive, only the CIA and, the Chinese government and Elon can possibly download the whole thing and without spending $1 billion.
Correct.
That would defeat the whole purpose, because then there goes the whole trustless thing. So exactly. That's the trade-off.
Yes.
That the smaller the memory requirement, the 1 megabyte, that allows it that it's a relatively low lift for anybody of modest means to jump in. Hence, the system is more democratic, for lack of a better term.
Right.
Okay. All right. So at this point, given that they decided back in the day, so who actually decided that? Was that just the people who first got into it and they just started doing it, and then everybody joined them?
A certain software system and said, "Hey, let's start mining on this." And you got people say, "Okay, yeah, well, we'll start doing that. We'll support it. I'll just, run a node and a miner as a curiosity, kind of accept the parameters that you gave," and it's kind of stuck. Which isn't to say it never got revisited. Back around 2017 or so, there was a big scaling debate about it. How, are we going to update the protocol? Which is certainly possible as long as you have consensus of the network users. Are we going to update it so that we have a bigger block size? Or are we going to say, no, this is the law. If we want to scale it, we're going to do these kind of side chain solutions I mentioned before, like a Lightning Network, or they call them.
Well, so the last thing we'll do, just so people know where we're going, let's just spend a little bit more on the 1 megabyte thing, and then we'll switch to the Lightning thing, and then I think that's enough, and people can take a breath. Some people now might be astonished and say, "What are you talking about, Silas? I thought the whole point was nobody can change the rules of Bitcoin. It's not like the government can just come in, or it's not like Bank of America can just come in and say, actually, no, we debited your account because you did hate speech on on Facebook." But no, isn't the whole appeal of Bitcoin is it's immutable. Once it's up and running and the community is using it, nobody can change it. And now you're telling me if they decide, you know what, that was kind of stupid. We should have done 1 megabyte. We should have made it 50 megabytes. We can just do that. What are you talking about?
So the answer is you can change it. It's just very difficult. You need cooperation with the vast majority of the network to do it all. Because let's say, just only a few nodes start doing things differently and obeying different rules. They broadcast their transactions. The moment that their rules diverge from everybody else's rules, then the rest of the network starts rejecting their transactions. And basically their new rules are just limited to those 3 nodes, and effectively becomes a separate currency that very few people actually use, doesn't have any actual value. So
is that what people refer to as a fork, or is that something else?
Yes,
okay.
That's what
so the idea is, if we're picturing the blocks coming down from the top of the screen, if the community were all in agreement, each new block gets added to the original chain. But now if 10% of the community says, this is stupid, we should have 50 megabytes, and we're just going to all approve transactions that assume that, nothing's stopping them within their network of doing it. But if the other 90% say, no, that's illegitimate, what are you doing?
Correct.
Now there's 2 separate chains that diverged at that point.
Correct. Effectively, you have 2 networks with everything's the same up to one point, and then it diverges. And one of the implications of that is, because they all agree on a common transaction history up to a point, it means that anybody that had currency on the network up to that point owns the currency in both branches of the fork.
Right. Okay. And is that what Bitcoin Cash is, or is that something else?
Yes. Bitcoin Cash is one of the forks. And so if you had your Bitcoin up to that point, then if you forgot about it or something, then you would be pleasantly surprised to learn, oh, I actually own.
Right. Yeah. I remember that happened to me, that when the people were arguing about it. And I mean, I knew enough to kind of know the big picture, but then I was really, like you say, I signed into, I don't know if it was a Coinbase account back then or something, and I saw that, in addition to my Bitcoin, now I have Bitcoin Cash. That's kind of cool.
Yeah. And this is a good public service on here. You have to worry about this a little bit, because sometimes if you have them stored on some central exchange or something, it's within their authority to say, oh, you know what, we're not going to bother with that. If you have,
right.
Chain,
so that's, and you're saying, because just for people, so Coinbase is that's not your keys, your Bitcoin, it's their keys.
Saying not your keys, not your coin.
Right.
So it allows them that kind of thing. So
a lot of times. You're right. Because I remember it was a decision by Coinbase to honor it or whatever, to host it, I guess would be the term.
Exactly.
Okay.
And that's why a lot of times you'll see, if there's an upcoming fork, a lot of people, what they'll do is they'll pull it off the exchange so they get a copy and then put it back on. So that's to ensure that they can control.
Let me make sure everyone's getting that. Again, with these things, Silas, I never know. Because the genuine insider experts, they're going to be like, yeah, we all know this stuff. But on the other hand, if part of this is like to educate, business owner. So again, folks, something like a Coinbase, what's happening there is they're like a regular bank, and how you don't have your $100 bills in your house. You give your $100 bills to the bank, and they say, we owe you $600, whatever. It's a legally binding thing, but technically you don't have physical control over the currency. They do. And so likewise with Coinbase, you could have an account with them, and if you think you got 8 Bitcoins with them, they actually are the ones in control of the private keys. You can't go to the actual Bitcoin ledger blockchain and transfer stuff. They're going to say, who the heck are you? You don't have the private keys. Coinbase does. Coinbase legally owes you that. But, the idea is, a lot of Bitcoin, enthusiasts would say the whole point was you control your own stuff. Why would you? So what Silas is now saying is, for people who, for convenience, whatever, they're afraid they're going to lose their private key or whatever, they just feel better having it with Coinbase or some other, I'm not picking on Coinbase, whatever, the thing like that is. If there's an upcoming fork, technically you could withdraw directly into your own wallet. So you have the private key, like you're directly controlling it. Wait for the fork to happen. Now you control the spinoff thing too. And then because of the convenience, the other reasons you can then go take your original thing and deposit it back in Coinbase or whatever to get the advantages of the convenience and so forth.
Exactly.
Okay. So what would happen then so strictly speaking, if there is an update that everybody agrees with, when I say everybody, like 99% agree, like if it was something stupid, and I think you even mentioned this to me, was there something they realized at some point with Bitcoin that, oh, you know what, this is kind of like a bug, and can we all agree we're just going to fix this?
There were a few instances happen, fuzzy on the details, but there are a lot of times where they made an update and it was like, oh, wow, we really didn't want to do it this way. And it basically involuntarily forked the network, because some people were going off of one set of rules, some people were going off of another set of rules. They kind of panicked, got together and said, hey, make an executive decision and say it's this first fork or something. And so that does raise some kind of implications there. It's like, well, hold on, is this really centralized now? And the answer is maybe yes, maybe no, because on the one hand, they did kind of use their influence to say, what's the branch that we're going to use? On the other hand, it wasn't like unlimited. They couldn't have just said, well, here's a bug that gave the founders a lot of money, and oh, guys, we're going to use that. That wouldn't fly. Most of the nodes would not accept such an arbitrary thing, or not such an arbitrary, giveaway to the founders. But in that case, it's just basically like both branches were like equally good, and then we're just said, in the aggregate, we don't care which one it is as long as it's one of them. And so their power was amounted to saying, well, we're going to decide which one, which isn't better than the other, we're all going to go with. And then that sort of influence kind of propagated on itself. And says everybody was like, well, we're going to agree with that. If they did an obviously, self-interested one, that might not have taken. In fact, this would be a good time to bring up a more troubling example of this, which is one happened on Ethereum. If you have some time to talk about this. A similar thing happened there where the Ethereum network was live, and then they found a group that was mostly the founders and some others. They put a new smart contract on it where they wanted to do their own little special kind of project. I didn't realize they made some goofs on it that let hackers, following the rules they put on the smart contract, drain of money in a way they didn't foresee. And in that case, I personally would call that an abuse of the power. What they did is they went to the Ethereum community and said, "Hey guys, this wasn't really supposed to happen. We really appreciate if you all, adopted a fork where that smart contract never happened and people got their original money." And somehow, by hook or by crook, they got the network to adapt to that, and they got the network to collectively invalidate that whole thing.
Okay, I think I remember that, unless I'm thinking of a different thing that was similar.
Yeah,
it was the kind of thing where everyone knew this is violating the spirit of what we meant, but technically, the quote hackers weren't really breaking any rules.
Right. It's one of those things where it's like, I obey the rules as given. They just, weren't well thought out.
Okay. And then, so in that, and I remember there was the debate, again, if you and I are talking about the same incident, I remember reading about the debates where, in fact, I think maybe you tipped me off at the time and told me, Bob, you should look at this. Is interesting. That there were debate. It was sort of like we got to stick to this. And if some people need to die, then so be it. But it's the you know what I mean? It was sort of like the rule of law is more important than any mere man or any mere bank account.
And that was where that became an Ethereum classic. They called it the one that didn't reverse the attack. And of course, the only reason this could be a debate at all is because the hackers couldn't, the smart contract was still written well enough so that they couldn't actually start using the money for about 30 days. So if they didn't have that lag, then you still wouldn't be able to reverse it because that money would become so thoroughly mixed with everything else that everybody would be depending on it, that the network would just be, most users would be very resistant about undoing a lot of valid transaction history. But because the hackers couldn't actually spend the money for a long time, then they had enough time to debate about what to do about it. So one said no.
Very interesting. Okay, so big picture for the folks at home now who are maybe like, this interview has warped my fragile little mind. Are they, so you're saying, because also too, in one sense is it like saying, well, if all the mathematicians and all the math textbook authors agreed that 3 times 7 equaled 20, I guess it would. Is it like that, or is it like something else? You get what I mean? Where it's you know what I mean? Like when we talk about the Bitcoin protocol and whatever, and what if enough of the
I would say it doesn't
miners,
change with the core aspects of it. It's just some narrow carve out that says we're going to follow all of these rules. Also, that transaction didn't happen.
Okay.
So it doesn't have implications for any of the other transactions as long as you get it in before they start mixing things. It doesn't have any other implications for transactions. Just some narrow carve out that says where part of the protocol is you don't treat that one transaction as valid, or like the initial contract.
Okay, so let me ask you: is it the kind of thing where, if what could happen is, let's say you're doing your thing and 90% of the there's some issue that comes up and there's a fork, and 90% of the network goes one way and 10% goes the other way. The people who are still doing it the old school way, we're doing it the way this is what the deal was, and tough, and you should have thought better about the rules before you signed on. Sorry, but pay more attention next time. Buyer beware. All that would really mean is then they're just able to trade among themselves. In other words, there's nothing. It's not like their Bitcoins would disappear. It's just that the relevant network of people who would even care, that they would be able to transact would shrink.
The smaller, less well-known user base that gets transacted. As happened, it's still alive. It's just the Ethereum Classic units are worth less than the mainline Ethereum.
Okay. So even there, this is getting almost philosophical, but it's not like the network voted to take your Bitcoins away. It's that the network, a lot of them decided, you have those original classic coins, but we're going to now hang out with these kids over here.
Right. It just became less popular to go along with the original rules.
Okay. All right. That's interesting. So it is weird. I guess it kind of just boils down to, what do we mean when we say you own Bitcoins, because they're not a tangible thing. It's more like the community recognizing that, yes, we're going to cater to you under these circumstances. And if somebody wants to give you a card in exchange for you digitally signing something, so be it. But in the grand scheme, it's not like, you own zeros and ones. So it is kind of a weird thing.
Right. It does. You're vulnerable to the implications of them changing the rules. The good news is that in practice, it's very, very hard to change those rules. It's only going to be times where the vast majority of the network is going to say, this is something we really need to do.
Okay. And so just to give an example, I think, I remember you and I were having these conversations years ago, probably they would not alter the rule to say there's going to be 21 million Bitcoins, period. Like they wouldn't just say, you know what, why don't we alter it so there could be 6 trillion Bitcoins?
Correct.
Like that would be such a violation of the ethos.
Likes it so much that they're unlikely to go along with such a thing. Although I know that as a caveat, Dogecoin, which was basically a reskinning of Litecoin, started as a new network. That community was very different, and they're like, "We'll take Litecoin, which like Bitcoin had a currency cap," and they said, "Well, we're going to get rid of that cap." So there was one lesser used one that did get rid of the cap, but it also wasn't filled from the beginning with dogmatic advocates of no, there's a hard cap on the currency.
Okay. So let's now, if we go like another 10 minutes, if you had the stamina. So one alternative, for this transaction scalability problem would be just to say, let's increase the amount, especially now too, that because more, computing power keeps getting cheaper. They could, do you agree? They could easily increase the block size by a lot, even without.
Because the storage has gotten cheaper and it's less of a barrier if we raise it. And I would say, just doing my own opinion, even at the time, at the proposal to raise the transaction size, it wasn't really insurmountable. It wasn't really going to scare off a lot of people. Like I think from a lot of the opponents of the larger block size, the concern was more like, are we going to set a precedent of just taking the easy way out and just bumping up the scalability every time?
Okay,
I would say that was a bigger concern than just like, is that specific one infeasible?
Okay, it'd be like, I don't know if this is a dumb analogy, but like, clearly when they passed the 9th Amendment, they put or when they meant and. Like I didn't want to read, I don't even remember what the 9th Amendment is off the top of my head. I'm just saying, but then you could see purists saying, no, we cannot just start second guessing what the text says because otherwise that opens Pandora's box. And
Right, exactly.
Okay.
Same kind of thing.
Okay. All right, so that's one solution. And then, in the remaining time, why don't we go to the other proposal says, no, keep Bitcoin the way it is. And then, max of 7 transactions on chain, the actual movement of Bitcoin, or, what do they call it? Satoshis is the smallest possible unit in the Bitcoin world. And instead, like basically people can have claims on it that are trading on a different platform.
But yeah, if we're doing the sidechain solution, the idea is like it still requires an initial setup. You still have to do a transaction on the main chain to like delve into that sidechain where everything's cheaper. But yeah, the idea would be that you can have a bunch of transactions that don't take a real transaction on the main network. And then that's how you ensure scalability. And it has its, its own trade-offs because we can get into those if you want. Like,
yeah. So is the basic idea though that like, so somebody, some other entity can go on the actual real world Bitcoin chain, and be one of those 7 per second transactions at some point and get ownership recognized by the, the Bitcoin community of a certain, whatever it is, half Bitcoin, whatever. And then now what that other entity does on the side is it allows for people to buy and sell claims on what it owns. And so like if you want to go buy a cup of coffee.
Right. As long as you're transacting with somebody that is also on that side chain.
Sure.
Then you have a cheap transaction.
Right. Okay. So yeah, great. Is that equivalent to, it said like if you do some work for me and and you have a Coinbase account and I have a Coinbase account and I transact in Coinbase, is that what happens there? Like, do they not work through, like if Coinbase is still the owner of those tokens, or sorry, those crypto, those
Well, what it would do
coins
is like, there'd be some like Bitcoin transaction level owners. They would basically be attached to a smart contract with somebody else. They would call it opening up a channel when you and somebody else open a Lightning Network channel in the case of Bitcoin.
Okay, so you're not talking about Coinbase now. You're talking about Lightning.
Right, yes.
Okay.
Or sorry, did you mean like using Coinbase as your way of scaling?
Well, yeah, because to me, that's the most straightforward. It's like with a bank with gold.
Sure.
You put your gold coins in a bank and then the bank just transfers the bank's...
I think more of the sidechain model. But yeah, like the other model would be like, you can just move them into some centralized provider. It's just some amorphous blob of Bitcoin with them, and they just know who they owe each Bitcoin to. And then within that, you can, move.
But the downside with that is you lose the trustlessness, which a lot of people think is the whole point.
You're trusting Coinbase.
Yeah, right. Okay. No, but you're saying with the Lightning Network, which is one example of the other, that is also trustless?
Exactly. It operates in a trustless manner. You lock the Bitcoins to like some smart contract associated with it.
Okay.
And then all those transactions are happening. The main network doesn't have to keep track of what's going on there. But when you say like, okay, whatever my remaining balance is, I want to move that back onto the main chain, then you can send out another transaction to free them. And they have their own protocols to keep you from like falsely representing how much you have. The corresponding danger there is that like, well, you're going to send everybody some, and then you're going to say like, oh, hey, look at this transaction record. It says that I have the amount that I originally put in. And there's a whole system where if you do that and there was a later transaction where you gave it away, somebody else can broadcast that to the network. And the way the smart contract is written is that if there's some shenanigans like that, if you're claiming things you don't have and somebody writes the proof that you don't have it, then you forfeit them all. And that's how the smart contract is written. So it's still, all this is verifiable by third parties, validating that, you tried to get the money out, validating that like, oh, you pointed to the wrong transaction, pointed to an early transaction, was invalidated. All of that is still works in a trustless manner.
Okay, so why would anybody, I mean, I gather just from casual perusal of Twitter arguments and stuff, I gather some people love the Lightning Network approach and some people hate it. What's the downfall of that?
The downside is that there's like the setup costs. The nodes have to stay online until they, formally come off within the Lightning Network. You still have to pay fees, and there are incentives within the Lightning Network for like one node to be like a central point that collects all the fees. And there's the fact that like, well, you're kind of trusting this. It partially centralizes it in that even though it's trustless, like there's a transaction history that like lives among this like network's control. So there are a few things here and there that make people uneasy about it. There are some costs associated with it.
Okay. All right. Well, all right. I think we probably plotted through enough of the terrain just to give people a big picture. But am I safe? I mean, having gone through all this stuff and seen the pros and cons, kind of the central theme running through all this is everything is voluntary. Like it's with any of these things, like no one's forcing you to do something you don't want to do. The absolute worst that can happen is, oh, if I had realized the community was going to do something else 10 years later, I would not have done my thing. But it's not like anybody is forcing you to do something or that is taking your tangible property away from you. It's just they're not recognizing the significance of what is yours all along, and they can't change those underlying facts. Is that okay?
Yeah. That's how I would say it. There could be times where it's like maybe you prefer to stay on one fork, and that fork becomes less popular.
I mean, I don't know if this is a goofy analogy, but it'd be kind of like if I go out and learn Japanese because I want to move to Japan, and then I move to Japan and everyone just speaks English. And I'd be like, what the heck? I wouldn't have spent all the time doing that. And they'd be like, we didn't force you to do that. We didn't suck, Japanese grammar out of your head. You can still speak in Japanese. It just, we're all going to speak in English now. You can't control what we do.
It's became an obsolete kind of
right. System. And so I might regret that I put all the time into doing that, but technically nobody violated my rights or stole from me. It's just I misforecast what everybody else is going to do.
Correct.
Okay. All right. Well, Silas, thanks for your time. I think the listeners got a lot out of that. So, folks, remember, if you want to go see the guide or booklet that Silas and I wrote, I guess we released it in 2014. Go to understandingbitcoin.us. We also, besides the mechanics of how does Bitcoin just flat out work, we also talk a lot about the economics. But in this episode, I wanted to let Silas sort of hold court on the underlying mechanics. So thank you again for your time, Silas, and thank you everyone at home for tuning in. And we will see you next time.
This concludes another episode of the Founders Forum. The information provided is for educational purposes and does not constitute financial advice. Consult with qualified professionals before making any financial or investment decisions. For more information on the hosts and for previous episodes, visit foundersforum.io. Thanks for listening.